ones in favor of workers' control were the FSPT, the FPT, the union that Maduro belonged to and somehow still responds politically to him, acted against workers' control during the last years, in the last 5-6 years, especially in Guayana, the region of the heavy industry. But even so, all movements supported the election of Maduro without any doubt, and I think that's a remarkable thing in Venezuela, that even if we have all these contradictions and differences between the different currents that support this process, at least one thing is clear, that if we want to even keep up the possibility to fight with each other about what is going to happen, we have to make sure that the government, like the official candidate of the government, Chavez before and Maduro now, win the elections. So that's at least something I would say quite reassuring, that this left managed not to fall in the usual secularism we always fall into as soon as there is just some loaf of bread to share. But but a few weeks after, and while during the campaign was criticized by a few sectors of Maduro's campaign as being very empty, not with content, but just playing on the emotional legacy with Chavez, not presenting a new project, and like playing too much the card of the loyalty to Chavez and Chavez's legacy. But in the first moment, it appeared in many movements that Maduro would have a radical stake. And he announced during the campaign that he would not be negotiating with the bourgeoisie, that he is going to discuss with workers and peasants, but not, and communities, but not with the bourgeoisie. He stick to Chavez's electoral program. Chavez, and we have to say that the electoral program, the government program that Chavez presented for 2013-19 was again a turn to the left. He wrote a fundamental article about the necessary turn, just not much time before he died, because he recognized that there was a growing bureaucratization, that they didn't reach certain goals and the things they wanted to do. So he was advocating for, again, a hard turn to the left and to a more popular-based politics. Maduro picked that up during the campaign and also a few days after the campaign by repeating like the slogans "Comuna or nada," so union or nothing, by invoking popular power, etc., etc. The opposition saw a chance to destabilize the process and to gain more power. It started like the whole campaign we know against the government, and that's where the critique then of the movements became harsh, because there is an impression that the government is slightly disoriented. We saw one thing, that if one thing characterized the Chavez years was that it was usually always Chavez and the government was in the offensive. And most of the time, the opposition was always running behind and reacting to it, and had to take a stand to the things that Chavez presented, had to say something on the things that Chavez did. And the impression of most people now since the election of Maduro is the opposite. Like the government runs behind what the opposition sets on the agenda. And on different occasions, like there have been strong critiques by the movements. First of all, that the reaction to the violence on the streets by the Chavez, by the opposition against the project, was not persecuted hard enough, not fast enough, that the response has not been enough like strength to show what is up. That Maduro did not build or did not use immediately a massive popular mobilization to stop the right. It has been criticized, the right is trying to create a critical situation by, since it still controls a lot of the economy, by creating emergencies, or there was there's no toilet paper, there's certain other goods that are not available in supermarkets and shops. What is obviously a consequence of lowering the production and of not distributing, because it's not, we have seen in the past, like we had in Venezuela, I don't know, from 2004 to 2007, 8, for example, problems with milk distribution. You couldn't get milk until the government simply expropriated the biggest milk producer, and since then, the following 5 years, there was always milk available. So it's not a question of being available or not to produce, but it's a question of distribution and of really producing. And of enforcing the laws, like you have fixed prices, what the government said, for example, price for rice that cannot be like more than a certain amount. What the rice producers then did, that was a few years ago, is that they, since the price was for white rice, they started just producing 90% of rice with flavors that was not with any price restriction. The government reacted and sent the army in to occupy the rice factories and forced them to produce 90% white rice. But these are measures we didn't see this time. This time, Maduro met with the head of Polar, the biggest Venezuelan transnational food company, to get to certain agreements about how Polar is producing and should produce, and etc. And that has been something also criticized strongly by a lot of movements, because at the same time that's what the movements accuse, there's not really an enforcement of the controls for guaranteeing the prices and the distribution. So there have been calls getting louder and louder from the movements and grassroots organization that now is the time to build collective leadership, that it's fine that Maduro is not Chavez, he cannot be Chavez, nobody expects from him to be Chavez, but so he is a president, and that's fine, but the process of revolution needs now definitely a collective leadership. These are, apart from the fact that these are initiatives or calls that have been coming up also during the last month of while Chavez was dying, like the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria, for example, is an alliance of the movement, the housing and janitors and pioneers movement and peasants movement, the Frente Nacional Campesina Ezequiel Zamora, the organizations of consejos comunales and others that are with them. Also a few different feminist and LGBT collectives are part of the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria. The Alianza Popular Revolucionaria already proposed, I don't know, maybe already like 8 or 10 months ago, that a collective leadership has to be built for the revolution process. The Red de Comuneros y Comuneras, an independent network of communes that samples about 80 communes in Venezuela, is also strongly in favor of a collective leadership. Same thing like Marea Socialista, Trotskyist, or let's say an organization with a Trotskyist background, because how things are going in Venezuela, you cannot really say that it's Trotskyist or whatever, but they are current inside the PSU. They have at least an influential part of workers' movement. They're in favor of a collective leadership and the radicalization of the process. Same thing for the different groups in coordinating around workers' control. So there is a strong push from the movements towards a radicalization and reassuming the initiative of popular power. At the same time, so this role that Chavez had to be able, first of all, not just to communicate, not only even in Venezuela, but we can see it also on the international level, how there is really a lack now that Chavez isn't there anymore. The media, international media, don't feel forced to report what Maduro says, or if President of Ecuador is commenting something that is happening internationally in the Americas or initiative of the US. But they did during Chavez's presidency, because he was a too strong figure to ignore. So we have now is probably, we can see also on an international level, that it's a problematic situation. Concerning the movement, I would say that it's the development since 2007, 2008, that it became clearer and clearer for the movements that Chavez is an important figure to interact, but that they cannot expect the government to do a social revolution, to build whatever communal state or whatever alternative revolutionary proposal they pursue. That was still up to 2007, just to make it, I worked a lot with communal councils and communes, and up to 2008, still you would go to some big meeting and people would sit around and they just have great discussions, but then like set up some kind of list of wishes, what they want from the government or the institutions, expecting somehow that since it's a revolutionary government, it has to do that. Obviously, it did not happen. I don't want to go into the details why, not because they don't want it or they're bad people, but because of internal contradictions, contradictions between an institutional logic and a social logic, between the need for parties, states, institutions to control social processes and the need of social processes not to be controlled because otherwise they cannot change the society. So we have all these contradictions, but it didn't happen. But from, I would say, 2008, 2009, it became very clear, like the meetings, centers of the communes or workers' control or whatever, people would gather, would discuss, and everybody would be very clear about the fact that either we do it or it won't happen. So that's something that is clear for quite a time. And it became even more clear now that Chavez died, and that's like the sad, in all the sadness, maybe the positive aspect, that nobody is in the grassroots movements, nobody is hoping anymore that there is one figure that can fix it or might fix it. Like it was always before, that even if people knew and the collectives knew as an organization, they have to build, etc. But it was always like the hope, okay, if Chavez knows that, he will like speak a word, do something, stop this, change this, etc. What was also true and certain to up to a certain extent, at least. But obviously not a mechanism that is very, let's say, participative, popular, revolutionary, or emancipatory. So this option is gone, and it's very clear for the movements that so we see now a lot of movements in the movements, like they try to do bigger conferences, alliances, congresses, debates, etc. to see how this process can go on. I don't doubt about the power, the ideas, etc. that the movements have, but it's obviously a question if and how Maduro can maintain this unity that worked up to now between movements, parties, institutions, etc., that have in quite a few things different approaches and interests. So this is now the big question.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sujatha Fernandes, who has written quite a bit about Venezuela. She has an excellent book, It's Not the Drums. But
what is the name of the book?
It's
called We Can Stop the Drums under the social movement.
Oh, right.
It's
2010.
Okay, 2010. And also, most recently, there was an article in the New York Review of Books by Alma Guillermo-Prete, who's normally a very, very sound journalist, and who wrote something. I leave it at that. But Sujatha wrote the first comment that I saw about it, and it's a really strong comment, and I think it was a very good one. So if you guys get a chance to read it, I think it's worth checking out. And Sujatha.
I didn't think you knew I was actually going to talk about it.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, forget that.
That's fine.
When you talk about the articles, could you cite where you did
Sure,
find it and
I
where
will.
you find your comment?
Yeah, sure,
Because it's
sure.
so provocative to say it and then not know how to find it.
Okay, I'll let you know. I was actually going to begin by talking, I'll move on to talking about the grassroots in Venezuela, but I actually wanted to begin by talking a little bit about how the Western media has treated the issue of grassroots movements, which is something that they haven't really talked about up until now. I mean, we've mostly seen a very kind of top-down approach here within the Western media towards trying to understand Venezuela, and really only addressing either Chavez or the opposition. And since Chavez became ill really again in December, January of this year, and you started getting more articles and more attention in the Western media, some sort of typically liberal, supposedly left-wing writers have begun to address this question of the grassroots, and I wanted to just talk about two which you may have come across, and if you haven't, one was in the New Yorker, and it was written by the staff writer John Lee Anderson, right? Slumlord John Lee Anderson. It was in the January 28th edition this year. And the article is sort of his attempt to go to Venezuela and talk to people and report on various kind of attempts at activism and occupations and whatnot. And of course, his perspective is one that just concludes that Caracas is this totally failed city. That is his argument in the piece. And then the other one is actually a series that the writer Alma Guillermo Prieto has been doing for the New York Review of Books, the blog. And so you can't find it in the actual New York Review of Books. You have to go to the blog online, and you'll find it there if you just go to the blog. I wrote a comment on the piece before this. This one is called Chavismo, the Crack Up, and it's about the television presenter Mario Silva. And so I would, if you're interested, you can just go to the New York Review of Books and you can read these articles. But my point is that these two writers, John Lee Anderson and Alma Guillermo Prieto, are ones who have typically considered themselves somewhat left-wing. John Lee Anderson did a biography of Che Guevara. Alma Guillermo Prieto is actually someone who I have admired for a long time because of her work, her in-depth work with for instance, she wrote a book called Samba, where she actually lived in the favelas of Rio, and she writes this very sort of thoughtful and provocative book about living there and about Samba and about the life of culture and about culture in the lives of the people that she lived with. And her other book is a book about Cuba, and it's a sort of memoir of the time she spent there as a dancer. And again, I use it in my classes. I think it's a very, very provocative book about thinking about the contradictions of the revolutionary process. And what is so interesting is that both of these writers and others, in trying to write about Venezuela, have such a myopic view of the grassroots that it completely colors their analysis of Venezuela. And what we end up with, particularly with everything I have read that Guillermo Prieto has written for the New York Review of Books, is just caricatures. We end up with this very kind of narrow view of politics, which has no analysis. And I think as long as the grassroots is kind of reduced to these mindless followers of Chavez, and we have no other conception of what is going on, that these kind of articles are going to dominate, and this kind of perspective is going to dominate. So I want to just read you two quotes, one from each article, sort of the conclusions in some ways. So this is the John Lee Anderson in the New Yorker conclusion. He says, now as Chavez lies dying, men who call themselves Chavistas convey his purported wishes to his citizens. For them, Chavez's death represents the end of a long and appalling performance. They gave him power in one election after another. They are the victims of their affection for a charismatic man whom they allowed to become the central character on the Venezuelan stage at the expense of everything else. After nearly a generation, Chavez leaves his countrymen, again men, with many unanswered questions and only one certainty. The revolution that he tried to bring about never really took place. It began with Chavez, and with him, most likely, it will end. Right? So you see, I mean, this is his conclusion after this whole article that talks about, his experience. And of course, the only people, as, Alejandro and I said, the only people that he interviews there are kind of, right-wing elite academics. He doesn't really get any perspective from anyone else other than that. And so this conclusion that he comes to is that, well, these people, they exercise their agency simply by electing Chavez over and over again, and he failed, he died, and that's the end of the story. Again, so completely leaving out any possible role for the grassroots. Now, I'll read the end of the Guillermo Prieto article as well, which is a very similar tone, right? Even to this and to her other pieces. She says, and what of the millions of Venezuelans who believed desperately in their comandante over the course of 14 years, now that the actors in this grim play are busy trying to set each other on fire? Sustained by the income from a record hike in oil prices, Chavista universities, neighborhood organizations, women's cooperatives, folk dance associations, I don't even know what is a folk dance association, and local health clinics prospered under Chavez's gaze. The poor were suddenly much less poor. In exchange, every time their leader called for a rally, they put on their Chavista red t-shirts and handkerchiefs and showed up by the thousands. They were asked to vote for a dying man and they did so. They were asked to vote for his hapless successor and they obeyed. Asked to believe that Chavez had visited Maduro after death in the form of a chirping bird, a tweet from the great beyond, they did not protest. Now they are being asked to keep the faith as their adored leader proves impossible to replace. So again, it's this idea that, you know, people pretty much just exchange votes in order to get the kinds of things that they wanted. So they wanted a health clinic, they wanted money, they wanted employment, whatever it was that they did, they voted for Chavez and then they got what they got. This very classical clientelist kind of analysis of the grassroots in Venezuela, right? That people are really just reduced to being these mindless followers and supporters who voted Chavez over and over again. And it is that absolute just myopic view that I believe many of these authors who could, you know, grasp more deeply with what was taking place in Cuba, who could understand a little better the role of Che Guevara in the continent, who could actually give us more fruitful analyses when it came to some of their other work, just don't get it in Venezuela, right? There's been so little written on Venezuela that has truly come to grips with the role of the grassroots and their importance in this whole process that many of us on the panel are really concerned about. Our research is really interested to see there is something beyond you know, Mario Silva and the opposition and Chavez and the actors that are constantly seen as the main players on the stage when it comes to understanding Venezuela. There is something beyond that, and yet that is not what we're finding in the media. So I wanted to just begin with that, just to give you a sense of, you know, of the challenges that we face here, because this is ultimately, if we, you know, really are interested in Venezuela and want to see things change, you know, move forward there. We face this battle of the hegemony of the Western media here, which wants to portray a single view, and it's really, really hard to break that view, especially when you have so-called left-wing and liberal writers taking that same position, right? So, okay, so I wanted to just to start with that, and then I wanted to address a question, moving on from what Dario had talked about, which is, so when we talk about social movements in Venezuela, what exactly are we talking about? Who are the social movements? What are they doing? And so just to give you a very quick overview, the landscape of social movements in Venezuela is extremely diverse and heterogeneous. It's not dominated by, say, trade union movements or by one particular type of organization. It's very varied, and it's has very long historical roots as well, as George Sicariello-Meyer in his book talks about, that these movements go back, you know, to the period of the dictatorship, to the post-dictatorship period, the guerrilla movements of the 60s, and again, as Alejandro talked about in his work as well, that these movements have very strong roots and historical lineages that include different strands of politics, that include guerrilla politics, that include liberation theology, that come from different sources and somewhat in the years since Chavez. And I'm not talking about just when he came into office, I'm talking about the period of the 90s when, you know, after Chavez's coup, when people really started to think that there really could be a break with this two-party system, that there really could be a breach in the system and room for an alternative to emerge, that all of these different movements started working together in different ways. And we saw the landscape of social activism really broaden. And so all of these movements that, you know, often located in particular barrios and as well in rural areas, thinking about indigenous movements, it's such a broad landscape. And in my work, the groups that I have been interested in are ones who particularly focused in culture, who are focused in community-based media. And these two areas, culture and community-based media, received a huge boost under Chavez. So he, particularly in the early 2000s, 2002, started giving a lot of money towards community-based media and towards the funding of popular fiestas, the Afro-Venezuelan fiestas, that also became a big source of just nourishment and for the movements in the barrios who drew on this ideas of cultural identity that came from, for instance, the murals that were being painted on the walls of the barrios and the Cruz de Mayo celebrations that would happen every June, and that culture as funded particularly and taken seriously and no longer persecuted, because the other thing to note is that many of these festivals were actually, prior to Chavez coming into office, were actually persecuted by opposition governments and opposition mayors. And so for the first time, with Chavez talking about himself as mestizo and talking about his his mixed origins and his pro-poor policies, actually became a space where people could once reclaim these identities again and talk about their indigenous roots and their black roots, and this became something like affirmative for people to do. And media as well, which really takes off, the community-based, the community media movement really takes off after the coup in 2002 against Chavez, where the media was shut down. The people didn't have any way for them to be able to communicate what was going on, and the fact that the opposition had taken over the presidential palace, because there was no, everything was shut down, and people really after that started pushing for started pushing for reform to the laws, started with the communications laws, started pushing for more funding to the media, and this happened. And so, just a few years after the coup already, there were, an explosion of community radio, television, newspapers with something like, over 200 radio stations emerging around the country in that time. And so there's this moment where of this real flourishing of all kinds of movements, and that begin to take on, maybe these are movements that have existed since the 60s and the 70s, that begin to take on new forms. They begin to use community media, they begin to work together with rural-based indigenous groups, they begin to build coalitions, and I think that the coalitions, particularly the rural-urban coalitions, is another very important thing that happened during this period, is that in order to both criticize Chavez's policies himself, but also to really bring to the forefront the issues being faced by people, by indigenous groups and others, whether it's from globalization or whatever it is, that these coalitions were a really crucial part of people being able to move their agenda forward. So I just want to end by saying a little bit about where are we now in terms of the grassroots in Venezuela. And I think that there is a level of uncertainty. There is threat from the opposition, and I think that there's some questions about the ability of social movements. How can they do their work in this climate? But at the same time, I think that the death of Chavez has also highlighted, as exactly, I completely agree with what Dario was saying. I think that the death of Chavez has highlighted something that social movements have been saying for a very long time, and that is that the need for self-organization. And I was doing my research in the barrios in 2006, 2007, so when there was really, people imagined that they were going to have Chavez around for a long time, and yet one of the main conversations that back then that people were always saying was, Chavez could go by, losing the election, the next election, anything could happen, and we can't completely depend on him being in office to continue funding our organizations, and so we really need to develop independent sources of leadership, independent sources of financing, and we need to become self-sustaining without a government in power, expecting that there's a government in power who's going to always support us. And so that issue of the need for autonomy versus, and of course, if you have a supportive government in power that's willing to open up funds, you want to take advantage of that. And so that was always never in question, but it was just this issue of how to become self-sustaining no matter what, and that was always being discussed. But I do think that that really right now, I agree with Dario, is that right now that there is a very generative space, and that space is one, hopefully, in which new kinds of collective leadership can take root. And then finally, I just wanted to make one comment about, what has been called the pink tide in Latin America, and particularly the very strong relationship, more than a decade ago between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and the number of things that they managed to accomplish and achieve in terms of regional solidarity and new kinds of projects. And with, Fidel Castro out of the picture, with the death of Chavez, that what is going to happen to this movement? And I know there's a later panel that's going to address this question, but I think that the grassroots comes in here in that maybe what we're also seeing is in some ways a shift away from this charismatic leadership to social movements taking the stage again, and I'm thinking particularly of the Chilean student protests, I'm thinking of Yo Soy 132 in Mexico, of these various movements that have used alternative technology and have mobilized different levels of society and you know, may be taking the stage at this moment. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Our last panelist is Alejandro Velasco from NYU.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks also for appreciating on as moderator. I didn't have a presentation planned, so I sort of brought this up from a series of research projects that I have going on to offer some more specific sense of the variety of movements that both Sujatha and Dario have mentioned, but then also to think about how those movements what those movements can tell us about what the broader debates and battles are, not just in Venezuela, but continentally as well, and in particular, again, to go off from Sujatha, why they seem not to be able to be captured in media abroad. So that's how I'll proceed. And what I want to start with is by just calling your attention to, perhaps you're familiar with, right after Chavez died in March, there was a debate as to what to do with his body. Right? So on one hand, there was a debate about whether we should embalm him and put him up for display. Then it turned out that they waited too long, and so that was scientifically not possible. So then it was, well, where are we going to bury him? So people were saying we should bury him in the mausoleum that was just opened for Simón Bolívar, which would be an interesting sort of play there in terms of history and it's imaginary. But ultimately where he was buried was in the former Defense Ministry, which then became Military Museum, which then became the place from where he led the coup in 1992 that overlooks the presidential palace of Caracas, right, so the Museo Militar. And it's, this is a very fitting location for him to have been buried, but not necessarily in the ways that might at first be apparent. On the one hand, of course, it seems very fitting because, as I mentioned, it's the place from which he led this coup, and therefore was the place from which he, where he first emerged in the national scene, political scene in Venezuela. And so there's a link there also because it was a former defense ministry to his military roots. And as a result of that, again, there's a very fitting synergy in terms of his being buried there. But it's also fitting because of its location in Caracas. The museum is located in the heart of what is known as the 23 de Enero neighborhood, January 23rd neighborhood. I don't know if any of you have been to Caracas, but just to give you a very brief snapshot, this is the largest, it was at one time the largest public housing project of all of South America. It was imagined to house 70,000 people in 1950s era super blocks, right? You know, the sort of 150, 300, 500 apartments per building. And it was imagined to sort of eradicate slums that had proliferated in Caracas in the first half of the 20th century. And they were built by the dictatorship of Fernandes. When he was overthrown, those buildings then, he had built them to sort of memorialize, he named them to memorialize the coup that brought him to power, but then when he was overthrown, they renamed it to memorialize the coup that overthrew him. So 23 de Enero, January 23rd of 1958, right? So it had a very deep symbolic tie, both to the former regime and the democracy, the liberal democracy that came to power. What was interesting is that during the years of Chavismo, during the years when Chavez was in power, was also known as the bastion of the revolution. So it's tied very geographically, it's in the center of Caracas, right next to the presidential palace. It's also where Chavez would vote, right? And when you ever saw images of Chavez going to vote, this is where he would vote, and you saw crowds and whatever, people from the 23 de Enero. It's also sort of, it had become over the years a sprawling sort of combination of both superblocks and squatter settlements, shanty towns, barrios, whatever you want to call it. And it's one of the areas where electoral returns for Chavez were consistently highest in Caracas, among Caracas parishes, where many of the social missions, the misiones sociales, were piloted. For instance, by Rodentro, which you might be familiar with, it was one of this neighborhood was one of the places where it was piloted. And now, maybe you've seen images of it, outside of the military museum where he's buried, the community got together, some sectors of the community got together and built a chapel for what you can see, it's called Santo Chavez, right? Saint Chavez. Yeah. So I just want to problematize this a little bit, and what does this mean? So there is a sort of tradition in this neighborhood that's marked by mobilization and organization that reflects the kind of popular power that underlay Chavez's calls for participatory democracy, right? And so again, this becomes sort of a fitting place for him to be buried. What's interesting is that the same tradition informs a contestatory relationship with the Chavista state that was manifested in a variety of ways over the years when Chavez was alive. For instance, in 2005, there were local primaries in the 20 de Enero, which were a direct challenge to the imposed candidates that Chavez had designated during local elections of that year. Contentious protests of organized community groups that pressed for local demands and accountability, long before communal councils came into play. These were happening in the community throughout the period when Chavez was alive. They seized, for instance, again in 2005 and 2006, the highest civilian office, the Jefatura Civil of the neighborhood. They seized it against the imposition of the Chavista mayor of Caracas, who wanted to place his person as Jefe Civil, and they said, no, we're going to have to put our own person here. And so again, they went against those desires. They expelled the Metropolitan Police in 2006, and they got rid of them in their entire neighborhood. They took over what had previously been the police headquarters and then transformed them into community centers, thriving community centers today. And sometimes there are armed clashes between state and opposition security forces in this neighborhood that Chavez would then have to sort of come out publicly and have to denounce these local armed groups in the 20 de Enero as anarchic groups, grupos anárquicos in the 20 de Enero, right? So there's this very tense relationship. On one hand, it's sort of seen as a bastion of the revolution, but it's a bastion that is very much forged in the fray of autonomous politics, which have deep historical roots, right? And what I'd like to argue is that this is actually far more emblematic, this tension between state and grassroots sectors. It's far more emblematic of what characterized the relationship, especially among urban popular sectors and the Chavista state, than sort of the caricature that Sujatha is suggesting of sort of pliable, obedient masses, right? Those tensions are what characterize the dynamism of these grassroots movements, informed primarily through these experiences and historical legacies of autonomous organizing and challenging the state. So at the heart of this tension is a variegated, which is not to say infinitely plural, but certainly very diverse spectrum of movement types whose goals and tactics range from, as I mentioned, armed colectivos to neighborhood associations or neighbors associations, which would be more legibly understood as civil society, in civil society terms. Now there's some overlap in this membership of colectivos and neighborhood associations. There's contacts and constituencies which thank you. Which also overlap, but they're decidedly different in their pursuits and in their trajectories. And what I want to do is just briefly sketch out two of these groups that, as you say in Spanish, hacen vida in the neighborhood, that sort of operate in the neighborhood, to get a sense of the diversity that Sujatha was articulating. One would be the, perhaps you've heard about it, they've had some international press, negative press. It's the Colectivo La Piedrita, or the Pebble. And George Aguirre, in his book We Play the Chavez, has written a lot about La Piedrita. They basically formed in the 1980s against the backdrop of what had been sort of a surging drug trade in the neighborhood, to combat, in terms of like vigilantism, the sort of drug traffickers in the area. Some of them had military experience, having been drafted into the military in the 1970s, and then drew on that experience again to challenge both the corruption of the military, or the police, and then also the drug traffickers. But they did so also by drawing from repertoires and ideological sort of programs that were deeply embedded in sort of leftist guerrilla movements of the 1960s. And so that there was a combination of sort of this locally oriented, but very much sort of martial presence to clean up the neighborhood with a leftist political logic. And then this became the heartbeat of what is a very vibrant local organization, which nevertheless sort of draws on both, again, as I mentioned, this militaristic on one hand, but then also very sort of locally informed political project. So this is one group, and this is one of the major groups that has given the Chavista state a lot of problems because it's sort of passed as a state within a state, and this is the one that Chavez called anarchic groups because they don't sort of follow the party line, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's another group that I'd like to sort of sketch out, which is the Asociación Civil Antonio José de Sucre. And this is formed in 1998 as an umbrella group of neighbors associations from all the various sectors of this broader neighborhood, Venezuela, which roughly about 200,000 people live in this parish. And basically what they do is every Monday they get together in a local primary school, an elementary school in the 23, and they talk about the problems that their buildings or their barrios have. And then they strategize which ministries they're going to go to petition and solicit funds, and then they're going to solicit those funds directly, and then they themselves, right, take those funds and then do the purchasing, and then the basically what would later become known as social accountability, Contraloría Social, to bring the improvements to their community. Right. So this was long before the communal councils, which became sort of the more institutional way of organizing in these ways, or in these spaces. But where these two groups, La Piedrita on one hand and the Asociación Civil Antonio José de Sucre, where they meet conceptually is in a very expansive understanding of democracy that upholds not institutionalism but accountability as its major pillar. Right, and this I think is what is really at stake in terms of grassroots, understanding grassroots politics in Venezuela. What is at stake is a much different understanding of democracy that is not institutional in nature, but that highlights accountability. That's the major pillar. And holding the state accountable to its responsibilities, especially with the electorate, through electoral means, but also through non-institutional means, right? So street protest, extrajudicial actions, et cetera, et cetera. And they see both of these as complementary rather than antithetical. Now, this is deeply troubling and problematic to somebody, especially, for instance, in the United States, whose vision of democracy is very much rooted in a liberal institutional understanding of what democracy is or should be. If people transcend the institutional mechanisms to air their grievances, then that is seen as a failure of democracy, right? What I'm suggesting here is that grassroots groups in, for instance, in the Venezuela, they see no contradiction between transcending the institutional mechanisms and apparatuses that are available to solicit demands, to sort of extract accountability, and those institutional channels. Both exist as a broad repertoire of democratic engagement. Right? So both of these are seen as part of a routine spectrum of democratic engagement rather than the sort of a measure of or mark of democratic frailty or weakness. And I think that this is both what scares people like Anderson and Guillermo Prietos and others, and also what sort of misses the mark in terms of thinking about what is actually happening at these grassroots levels. Just a couple more points. To echo some of what Sujatha had said, and also Dario, the relationship with Chavez, on one hand, yes, it was sort of based around these questions of sort of resource mobilization, but most of all, what you hear from people like La Piedrita or the Asociación Civil Antonio José de Sucre, is that what Chavez provided and what these social movements defended was less a particular ideological project than the room for local experimentation. that sometimes was seized by force, but was not repressed, that was created during the Chavez administration, right? So it's that aperture, right? So whereas before local experiments and organization were repressed either by the police or the military, even the fact that the police was no longer there and that we weren't going to expect the army to be deployed, that became the sort of the room to maneuver and to therefore sort of find ways of actualizing, making real those sort of projects, organizing mechanisms that we had imagined and we had partaken in for a long time. And that's what they were defending. And in some ways, this is also what becomes the great challenge now, especially with the revitalized opposition in Venezuela, right? The idea is not what will happen to the revolution if, if Chavez dies, but rather what will happen to the revolution if those spaces, those apertures are reduced and we sort of move back to a domain where sort of classic liberal democracy is imposed and therefore our room for experimentation is achieved. Okay. So just like to leave you with a few questions that I think that these groups sort of call to mind as a challenge for us here, right, in the United States. The first one is, how do we recognize empowerment, right, while also recognizing what we might call illiberalism? Right? So you can talk about empowerment, but sometimes empowerment comes through ways that are, somebody in the previous panel mentioned, messy, right? And that messiness doesn't easily fit into our understandings of what democracy should be, right? So how do we recognize that people that are empowered act in ways that are sometimes illiberal? Another question that comes up is accountability always best expressed institutionally? Right? I think that sort of the instinctive sense for us is to say no, but then we really need to come to terms with what that means in practice. If institutionality is not the best way through which accountability is expressed, then what else is possible? And then finally, what would happen if we refuse to ascribe, and these are the kinds of questions that emerge from these groups, what would happen if we refuse to ascribe either liberal or radical values, right, to particular tendencies, but instead imagine that these undercurrents inform a reservoir of political tools and practices that are available and adopted by any at different times, by any group at different times to fit particular goals seeking or keeping power, right? So it's far more spectral of a political sort of understanding rather than are they liberal, are they radical, are they revolutionary? They're all of those things at different times, right? And it's the sort of the urge, the sense of to name, the pressure to categorize that forces these caricatures to emerge, right? So what would happen if we think about these more as a spectrum rather than a either or, right? Modestly, what we would find, and this is what these groups express, is, I'm almost here, is a much more complex political landscape that's shaped not by heroes or villains, but by groups that are very riven internally, right? And there's nothing that's really innovative about saying that you look at this political landscape and it's complex, except for the fact that complexity is so often the first thing to be thrown aside when talking about Venezuela. Right? It's either revolutionary or it's a failed state, right? It's either, clientelistic populism or it's always grassroots participatory empowerment, right? It's much more complex, and so that's the major sort of legacy, as both Dario and Sujatha suggest, of these movements, right? And that they imagine themselves as complex, and the relationship with the state is complex, right? So if we sort of move beyond the dynamic and sort of accept that complexity, I think that we could have a much richer discussion about not just what happened with the grassroots groups under Chavez, but what going forward might be a more productive way to lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we've got a good deal of time, and I assume we're going to have some comments. So we're going to take a number of comments first, have the panelists respond, and then go for another few rounds, depending. So you're first.
I was interested.
I'm sorry, can you just identify yourself?
My name is Keen Blatt.
Thank you.
My question to the panelists is that all of you talked about this kind of period of flourishing, let's say around 2005, 2006. For example, you were talking about the communes, you were talking about what was it?
Media.
The media, correct, the social media. I'm having a tough time learning as an outsider about the permanence of this flourishing. So for example, we have like 200,000 cooperatives, initiated, but I've also learned that about 70% of them failed. So I mean, I can't find good government sources on any of this information. So whether it be anecdotal or empirical or quantitative, what is your sense of that emergence and how it's been institutionalized, how it's been challenged? What is the kind of lasting impacts of communal councils, of cooperatives? What role do all of these new forms of extra outside of the state type institutions, what role are they playing today, and where do we see that going? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm the person who talked about messy.
That was a great comment.
And I want to just pick up on that just quickly and to repeat some of the things I said before. I'm sorry, but the panels overlap anyway, right? I mean, the whole issue of dynamism and complexity is really important. And also the other issue about media. I mean, I've been asking these questions for 5 years, and the progressive press doesn't come up with it. They don't cover it. The Nation doesn't cover it. I mean, like this person, I've been trying to find out these answers. What's the real deal here? What's the process? What's really going on? What are the questions people are asking? You can't find it. And that's because we don't know how to cover it. And your speech was very helpful in doing that. We don't have nobody has the journalistic perspective because everybody's trying to expose the evils of the system instead of exposing the empowerment of the popular process. I just want to say that.
Yeah.
But the whole other thing is, that what I said before was neoliberalism is a way of making decisions. And you talked about that, I mean, people make decisions, and these guys all get together and they compete with each other and they try to get the attention of the head guy, right? And so they jostle each other and call out their cred and, blah, blah, blah. And they make poor decisions. And they make elite decisions that affect a lot of people miserably. And so the whole issue is, how are you going to start making decisions? And how can you, and there are skills, nobody likes to hear this because we all like to invoke the romance of the people self-organizing. But I'm telling you that you cannot, it's like doing yoga. You can talk about doing yoga forever, but until you start doing it, you're not going to get the results. And there's a whole lot on an occupier. You occupier? Somebody is an occupier. The soul of the Occupy movement has been a process of actually collective decision making, which takes time, discipline, and facilitation. And facilitation is that new kind of leadership, that new kind of horizontal leadership that you brought up, that issue that we need a new kind of leadership. And I submit that that is the kind of leadership where people can tap into this dynamism. It takes a lot of discipline and it takes a lot of commitment. But I don't see any other, the other route is utter chaos and defeat, I submit. But those skills are available. There are all kinds of sources that I can come up with and help you with to find facilitators and to train facilitators. Anyway, the end. And you talked about holding space.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that consensus decision making does. It holds that space so people can communicate, can disagree without, they can be messy without making a mess.
Okay, we have two comments right here, so.
Thank you. I wanted to get some information on your comment about the notion of democracy and finding those community space not just on electoral means but on institutional means. So I wanted to know whether you can explain a little bit more, and also to say if you think that this is like a new trend, not just Venezuela, all over the world. If you think that maybe we're moving to new ways of democracy to combine other types of tools and participation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Roger Harris. I'm visiting from California. I'm with a Latin American solidarity group called the Task Force on the Americas. I want to make a small comment and then a question. On the coup that happened in February 4th, 1992, recently we were in 23 de Janeiro. We used the same language you use, and we were corrected. And so, if you don't mind, I'd like to explain why we were corrected. There, they don't call it a coup. They call it a rebellion. And they make it a very strong distinction because it's not Chavez's coup, it's their rebellion. And they consider that the seminal event of their movement. And as probably you know, that the armbands that they wore in the morning all had the 4F on it, meaning February 4th. That was the beginning of the social movement. Of course, if they trace that movement dates way back before the Chavez days. Question now for Sujatha. I really learned a lot about your analysis for those two articles in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, and about how they quite didn't understand the nature of social movements and grassroots. But I'd like you also to talk about contextualizing that, because those articles didn't come out of the blue. They came out in a very important historical time where U.S. imperialism was trying to not only bury Chavez but his legacy. And perhaps you could put a little bit more context into why those articles, in a broader sense, have so much political traction.
Okay, we'll come back for you in the next round, okay? Both of you. So, you guys want to start responding?
Okay, about the permanence. Well, it's true. The problem is that there are not many sources in English available, but one is Venezuela analysis founded by Greg, who's there, and it's probably, I would say, the best one in English, definitely. But what is the permanency? I mean, I think there's also a lot of confusion because like, for example, with the cooperatives, when you say 200,000 and then 70% fail, it's not that 70% failed. 70% never worked. Let's say that way. And it's not, and that is, but it's not bad. That's simply connected to the idea we have that if a cooperative is founded, it has to work. The thing is that, for example, with the cooperatives, they made they abolished all money you had to pay for registering the cooperatives. They made it very easy. Then they had a law that all institutions, government institutions, have to take cooperatives for the jobs they give and the works they outsource or whatever, if cooperatives are available. So that led to the fact that everybody founded cooperatives. I would found like 4 probably, because if I'm doing workshops with somebody, then I would like found a cooperative for teaching and workshops with 4 of my friends, so in case some institution will need me or can I get a contract. And then I find, I make up another cooperative in my neighborhood with 5 more people, because if someday whatever is gonna happen, then I have the cooperative. And that's why like 70% of the cooperatives didn't really exist. They were just registered, but when the SUNACOP, the National Cooperative Supervising Office, checked what cooperatives do really exist, they were just 70,000 out of the 200,000. What compared to the 800 that existed when Chavez took power in 1998 still is a lot. They failed from another point of view, from the idea that they had in the beginning that the cooperatives would like emanate the solidarity they have inside to the outside and would help to change the socialist society. That didn't happen. Having 200 owners instead of 1 doesn't change the dynamics of capitalism or of making money. Most cooperatives, since there wasn't any alternative production chains, became part of capitalist productions and distribution chains. So that's I would say, where it failed. And after that, in fact, from like 2004, 2005 on, several other models came up for the democratization of the administration and ownership of the means of production because of this experience with the cooperatives. But so what is that? The consejos comunales, yes, they still exist officially 44,000 now, but I would say that they're doing a lot of work, they work in a more effective way than institutions, but I would say that like on a political level, the debate, the construction process, and the self-administered construction process has been more in the communes during the last years. The communes are the next level of self-administration from below. Several communal councils build a commune, they choose themselves the territory around what they started working together, etc., and still take the decisions in the communal councils, but on a commune level. That means it usually depends on if it's on a countryside or in a city, but a commune can have usually something between 2,000 up to 20,000, 30,000 people. So and that's a grassroots planning that goes up to that level. In 2008, even a ministry for communes was created to help this process. In the contradictions I talked about before, they were doing good work on one way with workshops, and another way at the same time preventing the communes from forming. Why? Well, because if my institution is responsible for it, be it a commune, be it a factory, be it whatever, the power of my institution is based on how many communes, how many factories, how many whatever I'm campaigning. The moment I decide they're autonomous or they don't need me anymore, the power that I have as an institution diminishes. That's why in a process of transformation like we have it in Venezuela, when every institution is questioned, every institution obviously tries to reproduce its power and its control and not to give it away. So that's a strong contradiction the whole time. Same thing happens with the questions about workers' control, about the Consejos Socialistas de Trabajadores that came up, like socialist workers' councils, came up from below in 2005, were discussed for 2 years. Chavez launches them in 2007, since that's the thing to do. Nobody in the whole government cares, really nobody. In 2007, they start then building these socialist workers' councils from below from 2007 on. And we have today a situation where it's again a vehicle of conflict and cooperation. I would say that the main motor of the whole Bolivarian process is this mixture between conflict and cooperation. And it's like from the movements and the institutions. We have today in almost all institutions and government administered factories and enterprises conflicts around the question of the participation or control by the workers. In many cases, through these new workers' councils, because the institutions try either to prevent them that they're built in institutions or to control them. If it's about enterprises, the workers do the same. So we have conflicts and all over. And I would say yes. The permanence does not mean that a certain form or institutionalized form has to be the same, but that the creativity and the conflict continues. And in this sense, the permanence is there, definitely. I would say we have today in Venezuela a movement for workers' control that is big, that has had national meetings. They have now in a few weeks a regional meeting in Bolivar, for example. That's something that when Chavez brought up the question of workers' control, taking it from small groups, it was a question between Chavez and a few small groups in 2005. Even if that's maybe also the reason why the government could publicize it much more. But the moment that it became real, like that many more workers supported it, a more conservative current of controlled production from the government became stronger inside the government. But we can see that there is, in the whole, let's say, Chavista movement, not a very big agreement with the PSU, with the party, if we look at the election results. The election, when the last election Chavez got elected in October 2012, 25% of the votes he got were not from the PSU, but from other parties supporting the process. 25% of the votes that Chavez got. And it's not, the cause is not that people identify with other parties, but it's usually that they don't want to identify with the PSU. That's the thing. Regional elections, different grassroots associations and other parties supporting the process presented different candidates from the official PSUV candidates in different regions. I don't go into details. Sometimes they were better, sometimes they were even worse, but that doesn't matter. It's not about saying, oh, it's all good or it's all better when it's outside the PSUV, but all these candidates became also, they got between 8 and 25% of the votes in a polarized situation where this could have endangered the victory of the PSUV candidate. Imagine in a situation where it's not the case, what would have happened with these counter candidates. In many cases, I would guess they would have even won against the official PSUV candidate. So we see that there is some kind of unrest. And in a small comment about the question of democracy, I think that I would even go further. I would say that the general problem is that we think in the North, or in this opinion has emanated from the North to the rest of the world, that liberalism has something to do with democracy. That's the main problem. I would say that liberalism is a basic condition for democracy. With liberalism, there cannot be any democracy. Democracy is tied to the rights of property and to capitalism. That's why democracy and liberalism had nothing to do with each other and were really at war for a few hundred years until they found the way to separate the question of the social question and the economic question from any democratic decision, and that's when liberal democracy was born. So I would say that it's really like a basic fact that democracy has to be illiberal, otherwise it cannot be democratic. And that's why the media, the politicians, academics, and everybody in the North, we're totally used to the fact that liberalism and democracy are somehow connected, cannot understand at all not only what's happening in these countries, but not even what democracy is. That's important. Okay.
Sujatha, you got something more?
I don't know a whole lot about the communal councils, but I just want to add to what Dario was saying on that question. I think that one of the issues was that Chavez was really trying to find some form of institutionality for this vast movement that had brought him into office and that had voted him into office, and so he would come out with these statements. When I was there, doing my research, the Bolivarian circles were the big thing, and he would say, everybody go out and form a Bolivarian circle, and everyone in their neighborhood would go and form a Bolivarian circle with each other, and all of a sudden there would be the figures, well, look at how many Bolivarian circles that we have in this country now. And then a couple of years later, no one was using the word Bolivarian circles. Then all of a sudden, everybody was saying communal councils. Let's all go form a communal council. It's just a search of a kind of institution, really. The term Bolivarian circle or communal council doesn't mean that much in and of itself, as it is the attempt to give form and shape to something that was the mediating relationship between Chavez and between all of these people. And there were so many initiatives, and Chavez had such popular charisma that he just had to say it, and all of a sudden, people think, how can we do this? Okay, let's get together. And I saw that in so many meetings where people would say, okay, he's made this announcement, and it's also funding, right? When he said communal councils, a lot of the organized social movements I was working with said, okay, what do we do now? Do we drop what we're doing, our own self-organization, and go join a communal council and make one? Because if we do, and if we have the whole structure of a communal council, we can get funding. Or do we stick with our own thing? We have our own name, we have our own structure and our own organization. That was a big question for people. And people didn't want to get left behind. They said, if this communal council thing takes off, we don't want to be left out in the cold, not a part of it, and doing our own thing and seen as somewhat antagonistic, because that's not our aim. And that's where I think that the problem was that often it was top down. Often it was this idea that, okay, now the government is going to create a new form of organization and everybody be a part of it. And I think this was one of the problems with the PSUV, was this idea that where is it coming from? And on the contrary, I think where these attempts were successful, and I think, I saw a lot of health clinics that were very successful because they were taken on by a community organization, and they said, we are going to renovate this building, we're going to bring in this doctor, and we are going to organize around this council. We're going to create a committee based on members from the community. And when it was really taken on as part of organized social movements, I think that those initiatives had a lot more success. And where, as Dario was saying, those 70% or whatever that just never really took off the ground was because it was someone's idea. You know, oh great, yeah, Chavez said let's do a Bolivarian circle, let's do one tomorrow, and without much seriousness or real effort to really do that. So I do think that was an interesting dynamic that we saw, you know, that did play out a lot. And it'll be interesting to see how that continues now, with whether Maduro has the same, you know, desire or ability to sort of mobilize people in that way, and what would happen. I just wanted to address this question on historical context. I think it's a good question. I think this idea of, you know, why do these articles have political traction? I don't know that I would agree that it's just one kind of attempt to reassert, you know, hegemony, and particularly Western capitalist hegemony within the region as a result of Chavez going from the political scene. Because I think what we saw, I mean, the John Lee Anderson article came out in January, the Guillermo Prieto articles have been coming out over the last month or two. And the media has had a really different, sort of interesting approach to what's been happening. Like right after the death of Chavez, all of a sudden, all of us who'd ever written anything on Venezuela were suddenly asked our opinion. And to me, that was a shock, because, you know, I was like, you know, the media in the US is not friendly to academics. They don't, unlike other countries where they actually want, especially what?
Progressive.
Right, but I mean, unless you can speak in a soundbite that, you know, will give the you know, the sort of catchy phrase or whatever it is, they don't want to hear what we have to say. They don't want to hear about complexity. And unlike in other countries where academics can really help shape, you know, the political climate and have input into it, I find that here in the United States that's really hard to do. And so for us, I don't know how you feel, but there was this moment where all of a sudden we were actually being asked our opinion. And I think it was because there was this sense of, wow, you know, this huge thing has happened, let's try and make sense of it. And we were actually able to have our say, and that closed up. I mean, right, you know, as the elections were happening and as that movement, you know, as everything that happened with the elections, and then, you know, with all of these really right-wing op-eds coming out of the Washington Post and all these places saying, you know, just propagating lies basically about what was taking place with saying there's corruption and that really Capriles was elected, and all of that, all of a sudden, they didn't want to hear our opinions anymore. All of a sudden it was like, well, now we really know what's going on. We know there's fraud, and we know because, and this is where I think that historical context comes in, is it was, well, now is our chance. Capriles got so close to Maduro that now is really our chance to reassert this sort of, you know, to bring back this liberal centrist government in Venezuela and to change the course of the face of what's happening in Latin America. And so yeah, I mean, my sense is that was fluctuating somewhat, but that we have come back to that sort of point of stasis.
Just want to say it's such a privilege to hear you guys talk. So, smart commentary. Just a couple of quick thoughts. I also want to hear more from the audience. But so, in terms of the messiness point that you mentioned before, you know, with groups like in this neighborhood that I mentioned, I think the issue again is, you know, that they understand that these spaces of experimentation are not a luxury. They understand that if they are closed, what's coming is, as we say in Venezuela, candela, fire, right? It's going to be rough. It's going to be, you know, violent, and they make no illusions about what's coming, right? And so this forces a kind of pause in the dynamism that in other moments, because of the sense of sort of safety with the margins, the electoral margins, that right now is in some ways suspended. And it's paradoxical, and I think that's kind of what Dario was getting at. The paradox is, we know that what we need is to deepen the ways in which social movements and organizations and organized popular sectors, we need to deepen their presence. But doing so means accepting this heterogeneous landscape. And accepting this heterogeneous landscape then also, you know, creates opportunities perhaps for divisions, disunity, et cetera, which we can't afford at this time, right? So it's sort of a paradox, and it's one that has so far obviously not been, you know, fully fleshed out. My own sense is that a lot is going to be that the coming municipal elections in December are going to tell us a lot about how willing the government is to actually allow these spaces to flourish, and to what extent they're going to say, no, we really need to have some sort of discipline. And if they say we need discipline, then my sense is that it's going to be a little bit, ugly at the base, right? So we'll see how that.
Yeah, but then you're still depending on democracy to sort yourselves out. And what I'm suggesting is there are other processes, skills, leadership styles that will help you maintain that sense of dynamism.
Not against the barrel of the gun, right? And so this is what's.
Well, it will help you to sustain a sense of dynamism and then to obviate the necessity of the barrel.
And not the barrel that you're pointing. The barrel is pointing at you.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
so that's
no, but it.
Maybe just let him finish
Yeah,
his
let's-
comment.
yeah.
No, but I think that the question is absolutely central. And I think maybe it speaks to your question as well, right? But I think just in terms of like the practice that I see on the ground, right, that you don't sort of discount that electoral terrain, and maybe that's sort of the liberal part, right? But they don't. I'm not saying that you don't, right? On the other hand, you do see this happening all over, certainly Latin America and other places. I'll just cite some people that have been writing about it. So Partha Chatterjee, for instance, talks about it happening in slums of Calcutta, for instance, or these informal understandings of relating to states, right, that aren't strictly driven by or dictated by whatever the institutional apparatus is. In Brazil, James Holston talks about insurgent citizenship, again, sort of these spaces and the squatter settlements outside of Sao Paulo that both seek sort of inclusion, but at the same time also want that inclusion to come with a particular kind of participatory logic, right? And so that those two moments are self-contradictory, but nevertheless alive. In Bolivia, Sean Lazar talks about this in the case of Velasco, outside of La Paz, right, and how they, over the course of decades, have organized sort of these informal understandings of democracy that both uphold a certain kind of institutionalism, but also at the same time transcend it. In Argentina, Javier Oviedo talks about sort of the gray zone politics of state politics, which again sort of sees this blend happening more so than either or. Right? So I think that my sense is that this is far more common. And the reason why it hadn't been sort of discussed, either theoretically or empirically, was because especially in the 1990s, much of the scholarship, and actually on the ground too in terms of policies, were oriented towards democratization in a very, as she says, sort of a very neoliberal logic, right? But it has to be sort of guided by institutions and decision-making processes that are sort of dictated from above, right? And so that's sort of the challenge, and maybe the issue is that sort of that was the fiction. And sort of the reality of it, the empirical reality on the ground was this, sort of these blending of practices on the ground. So to your point, yeah, absolutely. That seems to me to be far more prevalent than the alternative.
Okay, so we have two questions over here, the gentleman in orange, and then okay.
Thanks so much. I'll be really quick. My name is Quincy Saul, and I'm part of an organization called Eco-Socialist Horizons. And I guess I just want to add, I think I see on the table there the 2013-2019 plan. Is that what that is? Yes. On the left there? Yeah. So I guess I have a question about that, because I think it's important. This is in terms of when we think about what Chavez's legacy is. He has a hand in writing that. I don't know how many have read it. I think it's a very important, exciting document, and something that it puts forward. And it can be, we'll be looking at it for years to come. As sort of this was Chavez's last piece of policy that he put forward. And something that's very exciting, I think, in the last fifth point is it puts forward, they call for a new mode of production, for an eco-socialist mode of production. And they define it only in very preliminary ways. But what I've been reading in the last, I haven't seen much in English, but it's provoked this very exciting debate in Spanish about what's happening, about sort of a revolution within a revolution of how do we have an ecological society based on a rentier petroleum country. And they start going through, because basically all of the ALBA development projects are pretty much the same thing as the ALCA development projects. So the Bolivarian model is calling for the same dams, construction projects, oil drilling, not fracking yet, but we'll probably see it soon. So I've seen a very exciting conversation about that. And I guess my question is, I spent 3 months in Caracas in 2009 and saw almost no environmental ecological consciousness whatsoever. I know obviously it's different in other parts of the country, places like the Maracaibo Lake, which is totally toxic, and the source of the Orinoco River, where they're now mining gold. So I guess my question is, how do you see an ecological perspective evolving in Venezuela, specifically given the time frame which is outlined in this plan, which if we're talking about climate change, we're looking at 5 or 6, maybe 10 years before the coastal cities go underwater. So I think it's a very urgent question which has to be answered in the context of this, of all the complexities you've laid out. There's a whole other level of complexities. So I'm curious to see how you see this playing in.
Well, I have like 2 questions that perhaps the answer has already been sort of sketched. The first one has to do with what do you think that is like ideologically the threat that the process of change in Venezuela has represented? Because following what you were saying, Sujatha, it seems that these like writers and journalists in the metropole that usually one may think that are kind of leftists and that can write about Che Guevara or about Cuba without finding it very troubling, have a very different way of approaching what has happened in Venezuela. And I guess that points to certain ideological concern that the process in Venezuela has sparkled, and that nor the figure of the Che Guevara nor what's happening in Cuba can hold represents that threat anymore. So I just wanted to pose the question of whether you think, as you have been suggesting, that this has to do with how the process in Venezuela, beyond representing a geopolitical issue for the United States, has also put into question the framework of liberal democracy as the only legitimate way of political organization. And following into that, Alejandro, yes? You were posing the question of whether the change in Venezuela or these grassroots movements in Venezuela were pushing us to think different about accountability. But I was just wondering if we stick to the concept of accountability, I mean, if it's not too close, to political liberalism to still phrase the issue in those terms, because I mean, you still are thinking about the division between the government and the government, right? And it's a matter of, when you can say, well, the accountability doesn't need necessarily to go to institutions, but ultimately you are keeping that division, right? But what if you frame the issue in terms of a contest over sovereign power, right? Sure. How sovereignty is being redefined. So I guess
I think we gotta make that the last one. Just a second.
So Paulino Ochoa has this great book about precisely this question, The Time of Popular Sovereignty, where she sort of dabbles into the idea of what's really at stake when you're thinking about the relationship between state and society, and how is it disrupted, and can it be disrupted. She looks at it in the case of Mexico, or whatever have you, but I think the lessons are similar. I don't know if this is a cop-out or not, but I go as far as the sources and the folks that I talk to suggest to me, and they talk about it in the context of accountability, Contraloría, right? This is what they talk about, and that might mean sort of a representative logic. In fact, it does mean a representative logic, which is why they're so keen on electoral processes, but not as the sine qua non or the ultimate or the final way of being heard in the democratic system, but as one part of many. Right? So it retains that liberal logic. It doesn't discard it. To some extent, this is this is probably characteristic of the broader sort of logic of the Bolivarian process, which has been about these sort of parallel institutionalisms, right? It's not about like discarding everything that came before, but let's create new institutions that coexist at some points, and then maybe over time will replace the other ones, right? So, but that creates those conceptual as well as practical everyday life messiness. Do I go to the clinic or do I go to the consultorio, right? And which one do I use at any given time? Well, you go to the one that's closest. right, or the one that you feel has had the best response, right? But you want to make sure that it continues and it responds to the way that responds in the way that you want it to. And this speaks to actually the point about the Petra statement. All of these logics are founded on the idea of what is it that makes us Venezuelans? Oil and the revenues from oil, right? The reason why I make these claims of accountability, or can make these claims towards accountability, is because the resources that are dispersed by the state are not the state's resources. It's not sort of a taxation system that you can sort of say, well, I pay taxes. My tax is the subsoil, right? That's the underpinning of my claim to accountability. It's not pretty, right? This is partly what speaks to the lack of sort of an ecological, consciousness. It's no surprise, as most, I don't know the numbers, but certainly the folks that I've talked to that are ecologically minded are sort of middle classes and upper classes that draw on that discourse from the global north, right? It's not, you can talk about sort of the bombillos and whatever have you, but that's not a discourse that seeps into all social sectors, at least not in my experience. So that's sort of the limitations of my sources, not limitations, but sort of the realities of my sources lead me to this conclusion about accountability, which just speaks to this question about why it is that we can hold the state accountable, and has to do with this sort of birthright of ability.
Wanted to add on to the point on ecology, because I think that there is a contradiction in this idea that we're putting all the oil wealth of the country towards these social programs, but what is the cost of that, and how long is that sustainable, both as a commodity on the market, but also as a finite resource? And I don't think that there is, and that is a big problem, this lack of a sort of ecological consciousness. But you've probably heard about I think it was after the recall referendum, which was in 2005, 2004 was the recall referendum, and there was a huge campaign with people in support of Chavez were asked to vote no. And what happened was soon after that, when the Chavez government decided to increase coal mining in the state of Zulia, the indigenous people and urban social movements, community media organizations came together to say no to coal mining, right? So they're saying, we just said no to getting Chavez out of office, and now we're going to use that same campaign, the same placards, to say no to coal mining and no to increasing it. And it was a very powerful protest because it brought together indigenous groups from Zulia, who are very small in number, who are going to be affected by this, with all of these, majority social movements in Caracas, who could actually, that's what I was talking earlier about coalition building, who could really create a powerful movement. And I mean, visually, if you search on the internet, you can find more information about this, but it was a very powerful movement that really put into people's consciousness this issue of ecology, which I think is really central to the ongoing legitimate, sustainability of these programs.
Just shortly about that, there is even a second document that Chavez wrote and that has been hidden by the government during the last months, and it proposes some kind of new and second constitutional process, so constituent process in different areas. That one has been hidden totally. The government is not talking about it anymore. But about the ecological perspectives, I think that it's quite complicated. It's as complex as the question of liberal democracy. Obviously, there are a million elements of liberal democracy, and it's also not even a question of will, apart from the question of how do you invent something different. I think Steve wrote a few years ago that Venezuelans really don't like parties, cannot do with it, but they still haven't figured out how to do without them. And that's true. I mean, apart from the fact that it's not clear that we say, okay, there is a model, we can just take this model and get rid of liberal democracy. Today, if you get rid of the liberal democracy, you get bombed. So, and I won't say by which country, but you can guess. It's not just specific to, I guess that even if they find solutions for democratic proceedings or whatever, it will be a mixed model with a lot of liberal democratic elements, and the government, the general elections, and the president probably for quite a while, because it's not a goal to be bombed. And about ecological perspective, we have also this contradiction, I would say, that like Bolivia, everybody's talking about the good life in Bolivia and whatever, but we saw the biggest uprising against the Evo Morales government when you had a rise in the gasoline prices, and they're totally subventioned even in Bolivia. And for Bolivia, it's a problem to have these relatively low prices. So we have a contradiction between what are the expectations of the people, what these governments have to fulfill socially, and where did they get the money from, and what is the ecological consciousness. And I don't say one side is right or wrong, but the main problem is that even with very ecological ideas, these governments have to have the money to fulfill the social needs of the people, otherwise they will be out in the next elections and the alternative won't be more ecological than they are right now. So that's a really deep contradiction. The Chavez government had brilliant ideas about instead of building more electric plants and whatever, it's going to be like solar panels and here and there and whatever. And what happened? Well, people started consuming that much electricity that in 10 years they doubled the national electricity consumption, because now everybody has money, buys a TV, more lights, more whatever, etc. So, and the reaction had to be at some point that the government started setting up electric centrals with fuel. Why? Well, because if you don't, like the problems with the electric supply of electric current were at the last elections one of the main problems in damaging the image of the Chavez government. So people won, and I would say, like, for example, in communes and among peasants, there is a strong movement for with ecological consciousness. The whole commune network is working about the ecological questions, about organic agriculture. Same thing with the Frente Nacional Campesino. They built even an eco-socialist school together with the embassy, etc. So there is, but it's a total urbanized society. 90% live in cities, so that's still a long way to go. But they did some tries. I mean, if you see, like, the public light is turned more and more into light with solar panels, etc. But at the same time, the I would say the general consciousness is not at the point to connect that like a more a better environment also has consequences on what you consume and how you consume, and this connection still doesn't really exist. And it's also something I wouldn't say that the Venezuelans or Latin Americans or people out of the north of the world can be extraordinarily blamed for it. If we look what kinds of standards had been set by the North, what is to be achieved by people to have a nice life. So.
Okay, well, thank you all. I thank the panelists.